Well, thank you for that kind introduction. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here, particularly given the topic of the conference. This is what attracted me to come. You know, as a restoration ecologist, the work in that area has never been real easy for a researcher. The very notion of restoration is, of course, a value-laden topic at some level as we struggle to identify restoration to what and for who. As a restoration ecologist, the topic is, of course, somewhat value-laden at many levels. And as many other restoration ecologists have done, I've been considering for a long time restoration as a return to some historical condition, or at least some pre-impacted condition, or less impacted condition, I should say. For example, one with native vegetation. The land ethic of Leopold is one that I feel strongly connected to. However, I am finding my work increasingly complicated for at least three reasons that I want to touch on today. And those are, first of all, as the concept of ecosystem services has emerged, which you've heard a lot about at this conference, it's not only been a major paradigm shift that is influencing policymakers and managers and so forth, but it's really being, having a major influence in terms of shifting some of the focus in terms of why we're doing projects, and I'll suggest potentially even how. Secondly, the complication I've observed is that I'm beginning to see recent trends to redefine nature, that is, the idea of the social construction of nature. And then third, I would say that it's been my observation that the increase in the notion of the commodification of nature may be tightly linked to those two issues, namely ecosystem services and then how we define nature. And I'll give you examples of those as I go on. So this is in many ways very much a story, my story of sort of a progression of the kind of work I've been doing. And it really in part stems from what I'm going to tell you, my motivation on how I feel I can use my skills as a scientist, as a restoration ecologist, to try and make the world a better place. This is one of my study systems. It's one of the few reasonably pristine systems. Of course, it's not native forest. It's in the coastal plains of Maryland, and it's in a land trust. So the then and the now. So like many scientists, ecologists who are now doing very different kinds of work, as we heard John talk about last night, there's no question that much of my career was addressing very basic research questions where the scientists set the agenda, such as, you know, what is the role of biodiversity in ecosystem function? I use stream ecosystems as my model, and how does heterogeneity influence that? I spent a lot of time focusing on heterogeneity, and we still have some fundamental type, so-called basic research going on in the lab. But I increasingly, as it became harder and harder to find study systems without driving further and further distances from the Washington, D.C. area near where the University of Maryland is, I began thinking more and more about the degradation of systems and the potential to recover some of the things that we were seeing disappearing. So while I began, I would say, as the scientist defining the research problems, over time that began to shift. My first foray into restoration ecology science was really very much trying to do basic research in a restoration context. And it wasn't that different from what I had done previously. And I'll note that I got a grant from the National Science Foundation to do this. And it was the first time they were experimenting with funding restoration programs, or excuse me, projects. So this was the first panel they'd had that would consider it. And I should add that at about the time I got this grant, I was going up for full professor at the University of Maryland. And the funny thing about these secret faculty meetings where votes go on and so forth, all the time, you know, exactly what was said sneaks out. So I was told later by one of my friends that one of the big questions that came up, and I was in a department of ecology and evolution, was, well, you know, I think she's starting to do applied work. She got a restoration proposal funded. Now, never mind, it was from the National Science Foundation. So it was still sort of a very loaded thing to do then. It was not a very popular thing. Now, the experiments we did were pretty far removed from what was going on in terms of real restoration. So here's an example of a project that at about the time we were doing that other experiment, I had a colleague who was at the Department of Natural Resources take me on a tour of this. This is a stream restoration. Now let me tell you about it. This project, this stream was pretty much straight, and in order to put it in this form, most of the trees were taken out in this area, many of the trees. The channel was rerouted, so it was very sinuous. There were rocks, large boulders brought in to hold it in place, root wads, giant trees were stuck into the side of the stream to provide structure, the idea being that that would increase heterogeneity and that wood was good for streams. I went back to that site about 3 months later, and this is what it looked like right after a major rain. When the water receded, the channel was completely straightened once again. Interestingly, within the next year or year and a half, I don't recall, the project was redone exactly the same way. And then a flood came through, and it was straightened once again. So finally, the group that had been doing the project stepped back and said, something's not quite right here. They actually still have not done anything else with the project. So today you can see in the floodplain, I wish I had pictures of it, remnants of the root wads and the boulders sort of just distributed out through the field. It turns out that the story was very much one in which they needed to look more closely at the geomorphic context and at the supply of sediment to the site. And so if it had been approached in a manner that really looked at the processes that were causing the problem, and this was motivated by a buildup of sediment downstream near a bridge. So really this restoration project was motivated to protect infrastructure in many ways. And so what I then began to think about was, well, what else is going on in terms of restoration, and is it working in other settings? And so I undertook a large project where I brought together about 10 or 11 senior scientists from across the country, and Emily Bernhardt came to do a postdoctoral appointment with me, and she was pivotal to completing this project. And what we did was to develop a database, the first comprehensive database of river and stream restoration in the U.S., to look at patterns and trends. What was being done where? Why was it being done? And what was the outcome? And the idea was we really wanted to figure out, well, what works where? When is it context dependent? Are there different methods that work better or not in different settings? What we found was, in fact, that there were all kinds of definitions of restoration. So this shows the categories. We were able to reduce the roughly 39,000 projects in the database into categories that defined the goal of the restoration based on what was identified in the project record. That is, we did not define it. We allowed the project record. Usually that was from the managers, in some cases from a nonprofit group that was funding the project. We used their definitions, and you can see that it's all over the place. So stream restoration might mean something to allow fish passage. It might mean configuring the channel. You'll note that in some cases these do seem to be goals, like water quality improvement. In other cases, they actually seem to be methods. But that means that the project record didn't even identify why that method, for example, channel reconfiguration, was being done. Presumably, you wouldn't reconfigure or reshape a channel just to do that. There must be some reason. And so basically what we found, first of all, we did not find an answer to what's working and what's not. because over 90% of the projects had absolutely no information on the outcome of the project. That is, what was the success or failure of the project. Secondly, we found that the problem in itself, when and how to restore a stream, had multiple definitions, perceptions, and tacit assumptions associated with it. And so what I chose to do at that point was to say, okay, for my own research, clearly we need a lot more work on stream restoration. What works, what doesn't. We need to develop the science of this area. And of course, at this time, in the 90s, was really a very early stage in trying to develop a theoretical base for restoration, period, that aligned somewhat with ecological theory, or that was strongly informed by that. So I said, for my own work, let's let the managers define the problem, which makes sense. And so, in fact, in the region I work in, which is urbanizing areas in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed, primarily in Maryland, the biggest problem in these really rapidly urbanizing or already urban areas tends to be uncontrolled stormwater coming out of pipes. So inadequate stormwater infrastructure up in the watershed, so that infiltration when it rains into the soils was dramatically reduced. Water was running rapidly off the land. There are also major agricultural problems that led to degradation in streams, although I work primarily in urban streams. When you have a lot of land use change within a watershed, you tend to have massive erosion of the stream banks, with a lot of that material being transported downstream. The other interesting thing is that most of you know that train tracks tend to run parallel to rivers. The same thing is true for sewage infrastructure in most areas. Why? Because it's flat, it's easy to follow. So what happens when a stream channel migrates back and forth across the landscape, which is what they do, what they should be doing normally? Well, that means sometimes they migrate into a region where the sewer structure is. So one might expect that, in fact, the sewer lines would be moved away, but in fact what happens almost always is that the stream channel is moved, because it's cheaper to do that than to move the sewer infrastructure. So these were the problems the managers were facing us with. What do we do with the streams given these particular problems? So I said, well, what do you want out of them? Let's say we can move that channel. We also want ecological benefits from this. What are those benefits? And pretty much uniformly what was going on at that time was a desire to restore biodiversity, native biodiversity in the stream channels. And so that was pretty much the case throughout the Chesapeake Bay region. So then what I began to do, along with many other people, was ask, how can we develop a process-based restoration for streams and rivers? What are the ecological and hydrogeomorphic principles one would need to put in place in order to restore these streams to have the highest probability of restoring native biodiversity? And in fact, there is a nice foundation now, after a number of years, for restoring streams and rivers. And it includes things like, I won't go through all this, some basic hydrogeomorphic principles, almost engineering. You need to balance the flux of water down a stream, how much water is moving down a stream with how much sediment is moving down a stream. Both of those are natural processes. If they're out of balance and the sediment load is a lot greater than the flow that's available to move that sediment, you're going to get the stream bottom will aggrade. That is, it'll begin to fill up. On the other hand, if the flow is a lot higher, then the sediment coming into that system can maintain. That is, some of it should settle on the bottom. You're going to get massive erosion and incision of the channel. But there's a lot of other things. So for example, this particular concept was adopted most quickly by those designing projects. The one that has not been still is this idea of restoring the energy base. So oftentimes the trees are removed in order to get large equipment into the channel to manipulate it in some way so that there's a balance between the flow and the sediment. In fact, when you do that, you're shifting the system from one that's driven by sunlight or one that's driven by input of leaf material to one that's driven by input of sunlight, which has profound implications, particularly for the food web structure. There's all sorts of other things that come into play. So it's not an easy problem. I mean, it's a multivariate problem. It's not just channel design. It is restoration of a whole host of things, very much in the Leopold tradition. So here's some examples. In this case, the channel was highly incised, and what was done was the stream bank was regraded to be more gently sloping. Riparian vegetation was put in place, and over time that's grown up, and some of the native fauna are starting to recover. In this case, the problem was that a small dam prevented migratory fish from moving up the stream to spawn. And so the dam was removed, and over time the system has recovered quite nicely. The most common interventions, methods that are used to restore urban streams are in this category. So there are sort of two groups. One would be things that are done to the channel itself or the riparian area. Some of these I just mentioned. Another would be things that are done in the watershed. And these tend to be, in urban areas, the most important things. That is, you can regrade the banks. You can try and stabilize them with riparian vegetation. But if the fundamental problem of too much stormwater flowing into those streams because there's inadequate infiltration in the watershed, if that isn't solved, then the chances of that restoration project persisting and you actually getting final recovery is fairly low. Now there are a whole series of papers and projects, some by me, many by others, were then done documenting the outcome. A lot of case studies. This was done at X place. All these things were implemented. These were the watershed conditions, and this was the outcome. So this is just one example by a group that's actually in Wisconsin. But I don't want to pretend like restoration was always successful. Actually, there's been many, many, many failures, but they tend to be those that involve taking a structural approach. That is, if you thought about that slide I showed with all the different aspects that you needed to restore, the one that was focused on most often in these failure projects was just the balance of the sediment in the water without looking at the other factors. This just happens to be a project that I've been following for a number of years. I don't have recent data up. It was restored in 2000 in Maryland, and you can see that the reference site, this is one that is least impaired in that region, and this is the biodiversity in that stream, that really the restored site has never reached the levels that you see in the reference site. And in fact, what's interesting is biodiversity in general seems to be declining in all these streams, really probably reflecting the continuing increase of development in those watersheds. So in this case, as I said, I've shifted from the scientist defining the problem to the manager defining the problem, and the scientist trying to respond by saying, let's see if we can help you and figure out how to solve that problem. So meanwhile, if we step back and look at the broader region of the Chesapeake Bay Watershed, there were different regional goals. In the Chesapeake Bay region, so this is the bay proper, it's a huge watershed that encompasses 6 states and the District of Columbia, 68,000 square miles, a very difficult adaptive management problem in an area that large. The bay itself has been suffering major declines in terms of the historic fisheries that are so iconic in that region. I mean, you talk to anyone in Maryland, Virginia, parts of Delaware, and we identify with blue crabs and oysters. These populations are declining dramatically. For example, the oyster population right now in the bay is at about 0.1% of its historic abundance. Now, it's due to a variety of factors, including overharvesting, but it's also due to problems with eutrophication and large amounts of suspended sediment moving into the Chesapeake Bay. And so, in fact, what's happened is the system has been converted largely from a system dominated by benthic or bottom-dwelling organisms, seagrasses, crabs, oysters, to one now where we have larger plankton communities and the benthic organisms don't do particularly well. So, at about this time, I want to say it was roughly 2006, I began to notice it. It felt as if the regional managers turned from standing on the shores of the bay at the saltwater and looking out to turning around and saying, oh, you know what? All those streams and rivers in the bay are moving the nitrogen and the sediments to the bay that are causing the problem. And so, guess what? The problem was redefined for streams. So now the problem was not that we have lost biodiversity in the streams, that we need to fix the streams that are degraded, that are causing problems with infrastructure. The problem now was one of, is it possible that we can reduce the flux of nitrogen and sediments down those waterways? And so we asked the managers to tell us if, in fact, you want to accomplish that, well, what are your reference points? They still use the same sorts of reference points. That is, beautiful streams and rivers that are common. This would be in the uplands or Piedmont region of the watershed, and this would be more in the coastal plain. But the idea is that in these healthy systems, algae, which are all over the rocks in the bottom of streams, and plants are very, very good at sequestering nitrogen, at pulling it out of the water, at processing it, and even the bacteria in the stream bed consume nitrogen, and if it goes all the way through the nitrogen processing cycle, they will release harmless nitrogen gas into the atmosphere. Similarly, in a so-called healthy stream, sediment storage is one of the one of the major things that occurs in those systems. So you'll see if you have a high flow event, which are normal in these systems, the water will go over bank into the floodplain and a great deal of the sediment will be deposited there. So healthy systems do in fact do what the managers were now asking for. Degraded systems, on the other hand, do not, as I've already alluded to. The main problem being when you don't have sufficient stormwater infrastructure in a watershed, that is, infiltration into the soils is reduced because you've got a lot of paved surfaces now and roofs, etc. Then when it rains, if we assume the rain started right here and it progresses over time, actually let's say it starts here and it stops at about this point, and these hills represent what flow in a stream channel will do. In a healthy stream channel, the flow tends to increase very gradually, and when the rain stops, decrease very gradually. Why? Because you've got it infiltrating into the soils, being taken up by vegetation, slowly makes its way. Some of it goes into the channel, but most of it infiltrates, reaches the groundwater, and then moves underground to the streams, because most of the water in the streams is coming from groundwater. In an urban system, what happens, of course, is you don't have that infiltration. The water rushes overland or through stormwater pipes directly into stream channels, so you get really high peak flows, and then you get a really rapid recession in that. So they're very flashy. They go up and down. That then leads to this problem of much of this silt tends to be moved very rapidly, and stream banks get eroded, and that's thus part of the problem that the managers were in fact focusing on. So then the goal was that they essentially wanted us to think about restoring the ecosystem services specifically related to the storage of sediments and the removal of nitrogen. Now, this means that essentially what we have is a redefinition of the goals. The goal now is not to restore the whole system, the whole community, but to recover specific services. So we undertook a study to begin looking at streams in the region that had been restored and asking, do the restored streams actually have an increased ability to remove nitrogen and to store sediments? We looked at, we have a larger data set now, but as of last year when we published our initial results, We had about 8 streams we were following. 6 of them had been restored. 2 of them served as unrestored, degraded sort of controls, because you could not find forested streams, of course, nearby as positive controls. So we essentially responded to that redefinition of the problem and the goals to redefining our research objectives and restructuring our research program. Just quickly, I'll tell you the methods we used, and I'm highly simplifying this. It's actually not nearly as simple as it sounds. But to find out if they were, in fact, storing more sediment and removing more nitrogen from the water if they were restored, we did what we call budgets, sediment budgets and nitrogen budgets. And you can think of it almost in a very, very simple way if we just consider this cylinder as the stream and we measure what's coming in at the top above the restoration project and what's going out at the bottom, then you can simply do a subtraction and figure out how much is lost. I say it's not nearly as easy because you have to do this over all flow regimes, during storms, etc. And you also have to odd, well actually not odd, but different kinds of inputs, like maybe nitrogen and water is coming in through the groundwater as complete, all the way down the restoration project. So it's a much more difficult thing than it sounds, but it's the best way to really get a handle on if over long periods of time you really are having storage and removal. So we did that on a number of streams. We're now in our 5th year. We've got the stuff I'm showing you is from 3 years of data, annual averages of removal. We looked at 2 types of restoration designs. The traditional designs, which are the ones that are going on all over the country. These are typically called natural channel designs. These are the ones that are largely based on balancing the flow of water and the flux of sediment. But additionally, they almost always place large boulders along the stream banks to try and hold those banks in place. And the idea being that they want to maximize, or minimize any erosion and removal of sediments from those banks. Now, what did we find? Largely, we found no nitrogen removal in those and very limited sediment removal from the restoration efforts. In fact, many of the restored sites actually had net increases in nitrogen and sediment transport. I'm not going to spend much more time on this. I have a good sense of why this is the case, and I'm also very much aware that methods they are starting to use now are far, far better. But it turns out that there was a novel approach being developed by a very creative landscape architect that we began to work with. He was very eager to get scientists involved and to get good data on his projects. And what he developed was a restoration approach that was dramatically different from what was going on across the country. So if you look at this stream right here, and this would be sort of a classic urban stream, the stream emerges from under this highway as a pipe, okay? It drains a lot of impervious area, a little bit of grass in some suburban regions. And when it enters this channel here, it, in a very short distance, reaches the Chesapeake Bay proper. So this is a salt water. It's a very low salinity, but region of the Chesapeake Bay. And instead of using that natural channel design process, he created a series of pools, step pools, large pools, and in between those, small sort of stream-like riffles. The idea being that these pools step down the energy. They're all at slightly lower elevations because you're starting, this is all coastal plain, so it's not like high elevation, but you're starting at a higher elevation here than you are by the time you reach sea level. So that by the time you get downstream, you've stepped down the water energy and presumably stored some of the sediment in those pools. Furthermore, you'll see that this was highly manicured with specific species and vegetated. His desire actually was to bring back one of the native tree species in that region that had been gone for a very long time. So this shows the project here when it's mature. So this diagram here is taken just above one of those pools, so maybe above this pool here. So this would be the riffle-like structure, and this would be a pool. Here you can see before the vegetation has grown, these step pools moving down to the bay out here. So the idea is that the pools potentially would store the sediments, and the nitrogen hopefully would be removed both by bacteria in the stream bed and in the bottom of these pools and by plants. So what did we find? Well, it turns out we did find some promising results. At this time when we had done the study, there were only 2 of these types of projects that he had put in place. These are those budgets I told you about. So what you see is in kilograms nitrogen per square kilometer, how much nitrogen is coming in from above the project and how much is leaving at the end of the project before it goes into the bay. And then this is the net loss of nitrogen from the system. And what you see is that in both cases there is a net loss of nitrogen, meaning they actually are increasing the removal rate of nitrogen. And in fact, compared to the reference systems, they are removing nitrogen. It's small though, it's very small. And I'm not going to get into the issue of cost of such a project relative to how much nitrogen is removed, but that is a big issue because as you might imagine, there's a whole lot of ways to decrease the movement of nitrogen to the bay, and stream restoration is only one potential tool. How about sediments? They're actually doing a better job at removing sediments. So it turns out if you look at the total mass of sediment suspended sediment moving into the restoration reach and how much is moving out, storage is fairly significant. This is encouraging. One of the issues that we'll talk about, however, is what is the life expectancy of these projects? How long can they continue to store material? So, this is good, right? We've actually come up with a design that's removing nitrogen and removing sediment. The problem is, or the question I'll pose, I consider it a problem, many others don't, is it stream restoration? What we actually have now is a stream-wetland complex. We don't have native stream species. We have some wetland species. Wildlife have returned to the region. But fundamentally, it's a different kind of system. And so then the question was raised, well, maybe it isn't stream restoration. All the initial paperwork labeled it stream restoration. The next phase, though, of work we saw, and the publications on this, including work Keith Underwood, who was the designer, they were calling these regenerative stormwater conveyance systems. The idea being that, oh yeah, I guess it doesn't look much like a stream anymore, does it? So, well, the truth is what we're doing is we're designing something to take care of a stormwater problem, so let's call it that. And in fact, this was in major journal newsletters called A New Paradigm for Water Resource Managers, Solving Stormwater Problems. Now keep in mind, they're now solving so-called, if it's shown to work broadly, the stormwater problem at the end of the pipe, not where it's caused, but trying to take care of it in the streams right before the water goes into the ocean. So, the managers have now renamed the solution. It's no longer stream restoration, it's a stormwater conveyance structure. Well, that's interesting because now they're a class of what we call MS4s. These are municipal separate stormwater sewer system program types of infrastructure. So this is a national program and it's very, very good. It was designed to protect the nation's water, and any urbanized area in the US is required to have a plan and a system for ensuring that stormwater is not moving directly into streams. If it is, that there's a plan in place to try and reduce that, because that's a form of pollution in the streams. So the project I just told you about, well, since it's treating stormwater, it turns out it now counts toward the requirements for permits. So in a particular municipality, if you want to do additional development and you want to meet federal guidelines, you have to have, that jurisdiction has to have an MS4 permit or they're not allowed to continue. And they have to show what they've done to meet the permit requirements. So suddenly that project may count towards allowing an area to obtain its permit requirements. But you know, the interesting thing is treatment systems aren't supposed to be placed in streams and rivers, so-called waters of the U.S. So this sort of, at least this was the kind of thing I started thinking about, is it was stream restoration, but then it was renamed and it was infrastructure, but it's in a stream channel, which is ostensibly not legal if everyone agrees that that's a stream channel. So there are, of course, laws against filling waters of the U.S. I've talked about stormwater, it being used as a stormwater system. How is it actually done? How did they design it? It's a massive engineering project, so they go in with large bulldozers, huge trucks filled with sand and carrying large boulders. The sand, when it's first done, looks like what's in your child's sandbox. And berms are created, the pools are created, etc. So this is clearly manipulating a system and appears to be filling it, which could, I don't know if this has been legally looked at, but could potentially be in violation of Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, which is that you're not allowed to fill streams unless you mitigate for it. Well, so about that time we started seeing new stormwater conveyance systems being put in place, the same sort of novel design I talked about. So this is a new, relatively new one that one of my students is studying right now. And when this was put in place, she claims, and she really believes this, that it wasn't in a stream. It's actually in what is called a gully. For those of you that know any geomorphology, that's a head cut. What that means is a normal processes in streams and rivers is that, look at these tributaries. If land use changes here for some reason at all, and it could be natural changes due to a hurricane coming in and wiping out a bunch of trees, or it could be anthropogenic, that may change the flow pattern slightly down that hill slope. And when that happens, you may start to get water beginning to run down there, or at least the soil being very saturated. And often what happens is you start to get the bank of this larger river collapsing here. Assume that this stream was not in place, collapsing here and slowly cutting back because that's saturated, the bank slumps and falls in, and this shows one here. So the larger stream might be downstream, the larger tributary. This shows a head cut right here as the banks on the hill slope slowly collapse, and you're essentially getting what I would call the formation of a new channel. But in fact, when this project was designed, the claim was made that in fact it was put in a hill slope. So it wasn't put in a water of the U.S., it wasn't in a stream. So the question becomes, are managers redefining nature? I don't know. So those weren't streams that I just told you about, they're head cuts. But interestingly, this is a stream. These are considered jurisdictional waters. You can't see much because there's no water flowing in them. These are ephemeral streams. But these are actual waterways that are protected as jurisdictional waters. So when these are manipulated in any way, for example, if fill is put into them, mitigation is required. You may not be aware that you can do anything you want to a stream or a wetland as long as you get a permit which allows you to completely replace what natural resources have been lost through some other type of project. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Interestingly, those were streams, but these aren't. So this is one of my students. He and I and a couple more went to these streams in Tennessee that the state of Tennessee was calling wet weather conveyances, i.e. they typically only flow when it rains. We were out there on a day when it hadn't rained in over a week. It did start raining later, and you see there's clearly water flow. we were collecting insects in those streams because Tennessee has the guidelines that they will not be considered wet weather conveyances if obligate aquatic organisms are found in those streams. And indeed, we did find lots of mayflies and stoneflies, et cetera, and collected those and documented that. Interestingly, these streams that are called wet weather conveyances are downstream of this. So they're below a major old mine site that has ostensibly been reclaimed, but it still has large ponds through which, in this case, there's a lot of iron in the water, but there are problems in many of these ponds with selenium, high selenium water draining from them. Now keep in mind, selenium is something that's regulated. There are certain levels that can't be exceeded, and so if these selenium-laden waters are moving into those wet weather conveyances, but they're no longer wet weather conveyances, they're streams, then that's a violation of the Clean Water Act. So in this case, I would suggest it was actually quite convenient to consider them wet weather conveyances because they're not protected. So the question becomes, so what is nature? What's natural? We're seeing shifting definitions of that. Now, when is a stream a stream? This is already a fuzzy issue, as if it weren't by stream ecologists and geomorphologists who've been talking about this for years. But it is a very difficult issue, and it was made particularly difficult by a 2006 Supreme Court decision in which two individuals, Rapanos and Carabel, filed a lawsuit, or filed a case against the Justice Department because that's where the Army Corps of Engineers is defended by the Justice Department. And the Army Corps of Engineers had not given them a permit to fill small isolated wetlands that were on their property. They wanted to fill those, maybe build something there, I don't know. And they claimed, well, those weren't waters of the U.S. because they did not have water in them year-round. Those wetlands were only wet during sometimes part of the year. The Supreme Court came out with a decision that was called a plurality decision, which is interesting. 3 members of the Supreme Court said, oh no, those are waters. They don't have to be running all the time. There doesn't have to be water there. That's the Clean Water Act. It's always been like that. 3 members said, oh yeah, if there's not water there all the time, well, gee, should we protect those? I don't think so. And then Justice Kennedy went right down the middle, right? And he really struggled with it and ended up saying, well, if there's a significant nexus between that water body in question and a navigable water, then they're protected. And if there's not, then they're not. Well, all this did was to throw new language out there. What does significant nexus mean? And he actually said biological, chemical, or hydrological. So since 2006, all over this country, cases have been in the courts over whether or not wetlands or streams could be influenced or damaged or degraded in some way because there's not really hadn't been a decision, or I should say that decision threw up into air how you interpret the Clean Water Act. So I'm not going to pretend that what is a stream is an easy issue. Now let's go back to the streams I was talking about, some of which were called jurisdictional waters, some of them were conveyances, some of them were regenerative stormwater systems that had been put in gullies. If they are jurisdictional, how are they compensated for if for some reason they're damaged? And so I'll just give you a couple of examples because this does occur all the time. We can't live without impacting our ecosystems in some ways, so I'm not suggesting it's always bad. Building of roads, such as this project, which was the building of the Inter-County Connector near where I live, resulted in runoff that may impair some of the nearby streams. And for that reason, a large number of compensation or mitigation projects were required by the Army Corps of Engineers in order to permit the construction of that highway. Examples of the kinds of projects that were done to compensate, almost all of them are stream restoration projects. For example, here, This is a section of a stream where fish blockages were essentially removed, and that was a form of stream restoration. This is a project that was done in which banks were cut back and trees were planted. Obviously, someone has to make decisions about what the problems are in the stream and what kinds of restoration approaches might be important. Well, how about mitigating for something like this, for mining? So this shows you an example of the kind of blasting that goes on in surface mining. This happens to be mountaintop mining. And in order to get to the coal seams, the upper layer of the mountains is blown off to get to the coal seams, and then the coal is dug out. But that upper part, which is called overburden, is pushed over the side of the mountain into the valley in order to clear the area to mine. And in filling those valleys, of course, that's where the streams are in the Appalachian region of North America. And so the streams are destroyed, and so the question becomes, how is it that they mitigate for destroying these streams? This is the same picture I showed you before. That's an ephemeral stream in here. You can't even see it. There's rarely water that is protected, that could be filled and would have to be mitigated for. They're mitigated for by creating streams. So what happens is when the mining project is finished, there are drainage ditches on the mine site, and at the time that I was doing this work just a couple of years ago, the way most of the mitigations were being done was to take those drainage ditches. This is the side of a valley fill. The top of the mountain that's flat now is right there. These drainage ditches that go down into a natural stream after it moves into the remnants of the forested area, then those are considered streams. And so ostensibly the coal companies are planting plants along those streams. In some cases, they're changing the sinuosity to make them look like what an ideal stream should look like. They're trying to put in rock material, which is about the same size and so forth as the stream. So in this case, stream creation was a form. So that was going on for a good while, and this was while I was working on some of these issues, looking at, well, are those functional streams? Do we have evidence of processes going on? Are there bugs that are living in those streams? New guidance came out jointly by the Army Corps of Engineers and the Environmental Protection Agency, in which they, for the first time, had modified the compensatory wetland mitigation guidelines, which had been in existence for a while, to include streams. So now it's the water resources, essentially, mitigation guidelines. And what's interesting is if you read it carefully throughout the document, they use interchangeably terms like restoration, rehabilitation, enhancement, establishment, creation. Interesting. I had never heard of a created stream. You have to remember, in the case I had been looking at that time, when the mountaintops are blown off and the valleys are filled, the natural groundwater flow paths are no longer there to reach those drainage ditches that are being used to create streams. In fact, they don't hold water is what happens. So for a while, they were lining them with an impermeable material so that they would hold water at least when it rained. But this was considered stream restoration, and now it was accepted. So the definition of streams seems to have changed with the context. That is, in the case of the stormwater regenerative structures, gullies aren't streams in that region. In the case of Tennessee, wet weather conveyances aren't streams unless they have bugs. But in the region, the Appalachian region, and in most of the U.S., streams are protected. They had been historically, even intermittent ones. The second thing is that we're seeing that the mitigation requirements dramatically change with context. In some cases, putting in a highway, even if it's not near a stream, requires a lot of restoration in the region. In other cases, you destroy streams and you're allowed to mitigate by creating. And so, in fact, what we saw was that restoration was redefined. So now stream creation is a form of restoration. So the question became, I started asking, well, how do they decide how much is required, how much mitigation? Turns out that across the country we have different Army Corps districts that give these permits, and most of those, in some cases states, but usually it's the district, have different mechanisms for determining what the requirements are. They have a credit system. So for example, someone will go in and say, okay, these are the impacts you're going to do. That impact is causing you to lose this, this, and this, and that's worth X number of credits. Therefore, you're going to be required to recover that many credits, and usually they may increase it by 50% to assume that you may not have full recovery. This is just one example. I think it's from the Norfolk district where they had something called the stream habitat units. And just to give you an example of how interesting the currency system is, ephemeral streams are worth half of what perennial streams are. I'm really not sure where they got that number. The actual calculation of the units are a function of the area of the stream or the length, a habitat score, and then this number right here. Now keep in mind, this is just a morphological thing, the length of the stream. The habitat score is also a morphological score largely. They do look sometimes at riparian vegetation. So that was the currency system. It varies from place to place. So I would suggest that that currency system is really very much a commodification. That is how to value nature in this system. You've got to keep in mind that this is worth a lot of money to people who want to develop land, whether or not it's for extracting resources like the copper that's extracted here, or it's for building a highway. They have a lot of money to make if they can get those projects through. And so essentially this is a form of currency for them. Other currency systems, they're popping up all over the place. So since I first started focusing on these issues, this has literally been in less than 10 years. I would say even less than 5. There's now what are called stream mitigation banks all over many states in the US. This means instead of, if you're going to build a Walmart and you have to mitigate for some impact to a stream, therefore you look around you for a degraded stream, and the company has to hire someone that is qualified to restore streams. They have to design the project, develop a plan. All of that has to be reviewed by the Corps before it is approved, and the Walmart company, and I don't mean to beat up on Walmart, but whoever, gets the permit. Instead, they can go to someone who has ostensibly restored a lot of streams on a piece of land and simply buy one of those for a certain amount of money and automatically get their permit based on that. Some states also have what are called in lieu fee programs. Generally, these are run by the state, so it's not a private business where someone has, owns a large tract of land that had degraded wetlands and streams and they restored them. Instead, the state develops programs to restore, and you can put your money in that in lieu fee bank, and so in lieu of doing the project, you're contributing to that, and they will release credits through that system before their projects have even, in some cases, gotten in the ground. So currency systems differ. In the Chesapeake Bay region, we're starting to see, obviously, while environmental markets haven't really exploded, haven't taken off for interesting reasons, carbon markets have been around for a while. We're starting to see the development of water quality markets, at least the desire to do that. So there's a major push in the Chesapeake Bay region, and the market would be a nitrogen market. And the idea is that, let's say a farmer has a big piece of agricultural land. There's concerns that maybe excess fertilizer is running into nearby waterways. If that farmer plants a lot of trees, they actually can sell the value of that to someone who wants to do something else somewhere else and has to mitigate for that. The system most likely will be, let's say you have a sewage treatment plant and they don't have the funds or the ability to upgrade the treatment facilities to remove more nitrogen, and so they go to the trading market and find someone who's willing to do something somewhere else. So interesting what's developed. Now some of the concerns are that, are these being compartmentalized? That is, if we have a nitrogen market and a carbon market, does that create problems? Well, as an ecologist, if you know anything about the nitrogen cycle, You know that to remove nitrogen completely from a system, you've got to have carbon. They're actually tightly linked. And that's a theme we've heard throughout this program, this conference, the interconnected nature. So there's concerns about this that have been raised by ecologists. Okay, so where have we been so far as I've been talking? So I've suggested that we've seen a shift in who defines the problem. We've seen the problem redefined, the goal redefined, in some cases nature redefined. What I would say is the increasing commodification of nature and then the potential for it to be compartmentalized. Now what I don't want to do, well, let me first back up and say this raises a whole bunch of questions and I'm not going to go into all those, but they'd be great to discuss. Just a couple of examples. Well, who decides if we're going to restore services, if we're going to compartmentalize and just restore one or more services, who decides what we can do and what the priorities are and who benefits and who loses and what are the ramifications at regional levels if things are done at local levels? Are there trade-offs when restoration is designed for one service? So for example, those projects I showed you where you want to maximize removal of nitrogen, to do that, you actually have to create periods of anoxia in the water, that is low oxygen, because denitrification doesn't occur without that. The problem with that is that also mobilizes mercury from reducing nitrogen. Potentially, you're increasing mercury contamination in the water. So these are tough problems. The other thing is, the idea of being able to split up an ecosystem into its component services and then focus on those for restoration, does it decrease incentives for repairing the actual root of the problem? In the example I showed you of the stormwater problem, the ideal way to solve that is to go back up into the watershed, put in rain gardens, put in new stormwater infrastructure, actually increase infiltration in the watershed. Now, what I don't want to do is lead you to believe that I'm all critical and I'm actually working very actively to solve all these problems. And I want to just talk about a few ways for those of you that are scientists, the students, what you can do as a scientist. I mean, we've heard some wonderful things from the philosophers and the ethicists and the writers here. Scientists also have an important role to play here, and I would say we have a strong scientific responsibility, the most obvious of which is we've got to continue to not only produce research papers helping the managers understand if the methods they want to use actually are doing what they want to accomplish, but also policy papers where we actually try and interpret and talk about what are the environmental and ecological implications of certain kinds of policies. It's also important that we do things in high-profile settings when there is something that we really feel needs to reach a broader audience. And so in this case, this focuses on a paper I had in Science a few years ago with a number of other people where we undertook an analysis of, we FOIA'd all the water quality data from the state of West Virginia, their own data, and from Department of Environmental Protection, and analyzed that for trends in what was the relationship between the amount of mining in a watershed and water quality in those streams. And what you see is that as the area mined increases, you have dramatic increases in aluminum, iron, manganese, and in some cases selenium. So clearly there was a relationship that was being shown there. The other important role that scientists can play is obviously to generate new research projects that work again with the managers, the policymakers, the business leaders to try and figure out, well, what does work if those are problems. So for example, we've got a project right now we're doing with EPA, which we're asking the traditional way that ecosystem services have been treated in trying to do an accounting of those is what I call mapping of services. So you look out over the landscape and you use really detailed, important knowledge of how ecosystems work to say, you know, there's higher ecosystem services here than there is here. And it's based on things like amount of land in forest, which allows you to predict timber, potential timber production, et cetera. If you turn that, though, upside down and you say, what if systems are degraded and we want to recover services? We don't want to just map them. Is the relationship the same? That is, can we, for example, say, there's been tons of work linking the amount of impervious cover to biodiversity loss in streams. Some people say it's a threshold effect that as soon as you start to pave the stream, biodiversity does that. Others say it's a linear response, that biodiversity declines as you pave area in the watershed. Well, that would allow you to map services in that area if you just measured impervious cover, at least the biodiversity service. What it won't allow you to do is say, okay, manager, here's the solution, because I can tell you almost never do they have the ability to go in and rip out all the impervious cover. So what we've tried to do is say, let's turn the problem upside down and say, what's in the toolbox of the manager? What are they able to do? How do those things potentially, how could you use those things to influence various ecosystem functions and also structures that in turn help to create the service? And so this is a project we're actively working on with a fairly large number of people. Finally, I would say that you have to also do things like the scientists play an incredibly important role in translating their work to the press, in talking to not only legislators at the local and regional and national level, but to policymakers, and then of course in teaching. So here I'm showing a class that I did for about 6 years, actually with a colleague at Utah State, a geomorphologist, Jack Schmidt, and myself and Peter Wilcox from Johns Hopkins. We taught a stream restoration short course using those fundamental principles of how streams work and how ecosystems work that was largely taken by engineers and practitioners, and this was done every summer for about 6 years. And then, of course, in some cases, at least in my case, I've been willing to provide expert testimony about whether or not a particular restoration or mitigation approach would work.